You keep trying to build a life that's authentically yours while distrusting the only source of knowledge that can tell you what that life requires. How can you live from your true position if you've been trained to dismiss or mistrust the internal system it uses to communicate with you? Today, we're uncovering that contradiction directly. How you've been programmed to override your own internal compass and then wonder why your life defaults to someone else's priorities, timing, and standards. What I'm offering today isn't insight, but recognition of the exact place where authorship is lost again and again. Because you have an inbuilt system that communicates what is true for you from your authentic position. All of us do. You can think of it as your compass, and I call it the natural mind. We need to talk about why the natural mind is the very thing you refuse to recognize and trust. You already know what's true, but the moment that knowing appears, thinking steps in to dilute it, questioning it, dismissing it, talking you out of it, and just like that, clarity stops governing your reality. Today, I'm breaking down how the power to decide slips from direct knowing into mental evaluation, and how this is the difference between knowing what's true and living from it. In the last episode, I laid out a simple but consequential shift. Clarity isn't a special internal state you reach when everything lines up. Clarity is orientation. It's what you are actually oriented toward when you're deciding, interpreting, or acting. And most of what you experience as confusion isn't the absence of clarity at all. It's the result of being oriented toward internal constructions instead of what's real. This episode takes that one step deeper. It makes visible why that orientation is so difficult to sustain in practice. Not because your clarity itself is unstable, but because whatever you orient toward is automatically given authority. When your attention settles on something, that's what gets to lead. And without noticing, that authority is almost always assigned to the same internal system, the synthetic mind, the part of you that explains, justifies, and anticipates. You might assume that if your clarity keeps slipping away, something must be missing or underdeveloped. What's actually happening is simpler and more structural than that. This is Amara Strand. Welcome back to the podcast. What we're looking at today is not how to get more clarity, but why your access to clarity is consistently deferred. Why your default move is to think first, explain first, justify first, often without even noticing that another internal system exists as a source of direct understanding. This isn't a personal failing. It's a learned orientation, and once you can see how it works, you can stop trying to fix yourself and start seeing exactly where your attention is being routed. When a question comes up or a situation requires a response, chances are you don't pause and consult a deeper or more direct form of knowing. You go straight into thinking. Analysis starts immediately. Options are weighed, consequences are projected. The language-based mind is always on and ready. This happens so fast it feels like the only way to proceed. In many cases, there's no sense of having overridden anything because your natural mind was never consulted to begin with. The synthetic mind steps in automatically, not by deliberate choice, but because it's been established as the place you go for clarity. So it isn't that you register something from your natural mind and then ignore it. It's that nothing from that level has time to register at all, because the system built to explain, justify, and anticipate takes over the instant a question appears. This is an important distinction. The problem in this case isn't that you're failing to listen to your natural mind. It's that your natural mind hasn't been established as a legitimate source of clarity. I'm going to say that again because it's super important. Your natural mind hasn't been established as a legitimate source of clarity. Thinking is treated as synonymous with intelligence, so it becomes the default entry point. Decisions are routed there automatically because it's familiar and culturally reinforced. Once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes obvious why clarity feels intermittent. It's not being lost, it's being bypassed. The synthetic mind didn't become dominant by accident. It became the default because it speaks in the language you've been trained to recognize as intelligence. It uses words, it lays out reasons, and it shows its work. From early on, you're taught that if something matters, it should be explainable, preferably in a way another person can follow, evaluate, and repeat. Knowledge that behaves this way can be shared, debated, standardized, and passed from one mind to another, and that makes it legible and therefore legitimate. Now, the product of the natural mind is something I simply call knowing. And knowing doesn't operate this way. It doesn't arrive through steps or arguments. It doesn't present evidence or build a case. It's an experience of direct recognition. You can state what you know, but the experience of knowing itself doesn't transfer through explanation. The other person may understand your words, but they won't experience your direct knowing. There's another difference here that matters. The two systems aren't just different in how they operate, they're different in orientation. The natural mind is private by design. It functions as a personal knowledge system. What it registers can't be validated from the outside, explained into legitimacy, or confirmed by agreement. It can only be recognized by you as being true for you. It's personal. The synthetic mind is different. Even when your thinking is never spoken or shared, it's still externally oriented by design. It operates in reference to how something would be perceived, evaluated, or judged from the outside. It relies on external frameworks that you likely never consciously chose. And let me explain something that you definitely experience and recognize, but perhaps you've never clearly understood. The synthetic mind assumes an internalized authority, an observer, critic, or standard that stands in for external validation. So even when you're not sharing your thinking with anyone, the act of thinking is organized around explanation, comparison, and whether something would hold up to external frameworks and expectations. You experience this as the near constant presence of something inside that watches you, surveils you, judges you, compares what you're feeling, doing, or thinking against some externally derived standard or idea. Even when you're alone with your thoughts, the nature of that system is externally oriented. So most of what you experience through the natural mind is private. It's personal. Now, that doesn't mean the natural mind's knowing can't transmit or scale. Some contemporary theories, Rupert Sheldrake's work on morphic fields is one example, suggest that patterns don't always spread because someone teaches them. Instead, once a pattern exists, it may become easier for others to recognize directly through their own natural minds without instruction. You don't learn it by being told. You recognize it by direct contact through the natural mind. And whether you accept that model or not isn't the point. What matters is that it describes a completely different way of transmission that can happen, one that doesn't rely on explanation, justification, or argument to work. This mode of knowing and transmission is deeply mistrusted in our culture, not because it has been conclusively disproven, but because it doesn't conform to how you expect knowledge to behave. The discomfort here isn't just scientific, it's about what we've decided counts as real knowledge. Now, our culture overwhelmingly privileges knowledge that can be articulated and defended. Conceptual knowledge moves cleanly through this channel. It can be taught, repeated, and reinforced across individuals and institutions. Personal, experiential knowing does not, because it can't be explained into existence or transferred through justification. It's treated as incomplete, unreliable, or mysterious, even when it proves accurate over time. The consequence of this conditioning is straightforward. You learn implicitly that what can't be explained can't be trusted. And because knowing doesn't arrive via language and never seeks to defend its position, it loses status as an authority source. Thinking doesn't just feel familiar, it feels legitimate. So when a question arises, authority remains with the synthetic mind by default, not because it's the best choice, but because it's the only system you've been trained to recognize as credible. Once you see that your understanding of reality, a lens through which you interpret, decide, and act, is governed by where authority is placed, the failure point becomes very specific and clear. It's not that knowing disappears, it's that authority is already rooted in the other system. So as I explained, there are many times when you don't register any kind of knowing at all. You just go straight to the synthetic mind. But sometimes the natural mind breaks through the noise and you do register a clear, immediate, and complete knowing. What happens next? The moment your knowing arises, there's a familiar reflex. You turn toward explanation. You ask whether it makes sense, whether it can be justified, whether it will hold up if questioned. Often, you also check whether it's convenient, whether it fits cleanly with your plans, your compromises, or the position you've already taken. Knowing doesn't do that. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't hedge. It doesn't arrange itself around the conditions that brought you here. It simply registers what's true for you. And often, that's not very convenient. Turning away from that and toward explanation, it feels responsible. It feels like due diligence. But what's actually happening is procedural. Authority is being conferred on thinking rather than on knowing. And once that happens, orientation shifts back to its default. This is where the experience of losing clarity comes from. Nothing has been added, nothing has gone wrong internally. The governing system has simply changed. What you're oriented toward is no longer direct contact, but the synthetic mind's evaluation. From that point on, your understanding is filtered through prediction, comparison, and anticipated response rather than through what you already know to be true for you. Overthinking fits cleanly into this picture. It's rarely about confusion. It's usually an attempt to retrofit justification onto something that was already clear enough to act on. In these instances, you're not trying to find the answer. You're trying to either justify what you already know or talk yourself out of it. Both moves rely on the same process: explanation, comparison, justification. And that mental effort can go on for a long time and wear you out in the process. The difference between the two systems is also energetic. The natural mind doesn't work hard. You don't experience it as work. It doesn't generate activity or drain your energy. When something is known, it's simply clear, it's immediate. There's no strain, no momentum, no sense of pushing something through. The synthetic mind is different. It exists in a continuous state of activity. Reasons have to be generated, counter reasons have to be anticipated, scenarios are run, outcomes are evaluated. The inner critic or judge needs to be satisfied. Energy is burned keeping this process going, and that's why this mode feels effortful and mentally consuming. Not because the situation requires it, but because the synthetic mind has no natural resting point. This is another reason the pattern persists. The natural mind registers and stops. The synthetic mind stays active and keeps producing content. So when authority is rooted there, ongoing effort starts to feel normal, and mental strain gets mistaken for careful consideration. This is also why insight alone doesn't change the pattern. You can recognize what's happening and still repeat it because the issue isn't understanding. It's default procedure. The synthetic mind is already dominant. It's running continuously, shaping your experience of reality. Until authority is consciously reclaimed, it will continue to burn through your energy and define the terms you live inside. Seen this way, the problem isn't internal noise or lack of perception. The synthetic mind is what generates that noise in the first place. The problem is a structural habit. Authority is being assigned to the externally oriented system that explains rather than to the internally oriented system that knows. And as long as that habit runs unchecked, clarity will continue to appear and then be set aside, not because you can't access clarity, but because you don't allow it to lead. Once you can see how authority is actually assigned, the pattern stops being theoretical. You can observe it directly in real time, not by analyzing it and not by trying to correct it, but by noticing what happens the moment clarity appears. What becomes apparent very quickly is that insight isn't the limiting factor. Seeing the pattern doesn't automatically change it. Here's what few people realize. Living from the clarity of the natural mind carries a real load, and most people aren't structured to hold the weight of their own authority for long. And that's what the next episode is going to be about, what it actually takes to hold authority without immediately handing it back to your synthetic mind for relief. You don't need to resolve that yet, just notice it. The next time clarity appears, notice what gets authority. Clarity or the mental activity that immediately follows. Thank you for sharing this time with me today, and I'll talk to you again soon.